He went and addressed the House of Representatives. I know, but he's going to be very cute. But I think he's.
You have like a cultural arm to it. And it was funny because my bestie there was like, oh, I'm just here for my retirement. And I was like, yeah, and we would see each other all the time.
It'll just go right back on its own. They could lots of
Yeah. They had like this cute little pop-ups around. And there was this one where they had like this fish-shaped bread filled with purple almond. Do you know blueberry? Oh, no. Not just summer. So if I had gone to Disney, we would have totally seen each other. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this IOP Speaker Series event, Houthis Who, an inside look at the militia disrupting the globe. My name is Megan Holbe, and I'm a second year in the college majoring in public policy and psychology. I currently serve as an event ambassador and member of the W+ Winter Institute Planning Committee. It is my honor to introduce our guests, Eric Schmitt, Salih Noor, and Stacey Philbrick Yadav. Eric Schmitt has been a Pentagon reporter at the New York Times for 40 years and has written extensively on security matters in the Middle East, South Asia, Africa, and Europe, and has shared 4 Pulitzer Prizes for his coverage. He earned his bachelor's degree in political science from Williams College and was a journalism fellow at Stanford University. In 2011, he co-wrote Counterstrike, The Untold Story of America's Secret Campaign Against Al-Qaeda, which provides an insider's look on how the US government has adapted its strategy for fighting terrorism since 2001. Salih Noor is currently a UChicago Harper-Schmidt Fellow teaching global society in the college. His research lies in comparative democratization, colonization, and post-colonial development, with a focus on Africa. He earned an MA in political science from Osnabrück University, Germany, and a BA in political science from University of Asmara in Eritrea, where he was born and raised. His recent dissertation project at Northwestern focused on revolution, liberal reformism, and political development in Southern Africa. Stacey Philbrick Yadav is the chair of international relations at Hobart and William Smith Colleges in Geneva, New York, and a non-resident fellow at the Crown Center for Middle East Studies at Brandeis University. She has served as the chair of the Middle East and North African Politics section of the American Political Association and a member of the editorial committee at Middle East Report. For almost 2 decades, she has written about the politics of Yemen, with a focus on opposition activism within and outside of partisan frameworks. In 2023, she published her book called Yemen in the Shadow of Transition, Pursuing Justice Amid War, which was informed by her extensive research and fieldwork on Yemen's evolving conflict dynamics. Our conversation this afternoon will be moderated by IOP Senior Director and former New York Times reporter Jennifer Steinhauer, whose last beat covered the Pentagon. Before we start our event, I will give some quick reminders. First, we kindly ask everyone to silence and turn off their cell phones. There will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end, with first priority given to students. Our next speaker series event, Southeast Asia in an Era of Strategic Competition, will be tomorrow at 12 p.m. in the IOP living room. And on Tuesday, we'll host Free Trade in the Balance, a discussion with U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai at 5:30 p.m. at Ida Noyes Hall. To register for these events and other opportunities at the Institute of Politics, please visit our website. Thanks again for joining us. Please give a warm welcome to Eric Schmitt, Salih Noor, Stacey Philbrick Yadav, and Jennifer Steinhauer.
to remind people, this particular form of speaker series is pop-up. These are exactly what they sound like. These are quick events that we pop up based off the news. As a result, we always have two guests joining us by Zoom. That enables us to get guests together quickly. As you can see, all of our guests are total slackers with very light resumes. The best we could do today. So we're so thrilled to be able to have three distinguished guests here to talk about this topic that everyone's been trying to learn more about on campus and beyond. And we will give ample time for questions. So go ahead and know that we'll be doing plenty of that at the end. The only other note I would say is I will moderate this discussion. I am not the expert here. These three are, so you should feel free to engage one another and have I will moderate that conversation, but please feel free to respond to one another. I will cut people off if we need to move the conversation along, but I expect the three of you who know far more than I do about this topic will be quite interactive. So we are here today to learn more about the Houthis, a Shi'i organization with ties to Iran that has long been embroiled in Yemen's protracted civil war in a broader region where Sunni Muslims are largely dominant. They have now found themselves at the center of a widening conflict in the Middle East. The group has repeatedly attacked commercial ships in the Red Sea. In recent weeks, its members say to pressure Israel to end its military campaign in Gaza. And earlier this week, a cruise missile launched by the Houthis in the Red Sea came within a mile of a U.S. destroyer before it was shot down. And that's the closest a Houthi attack has actually come to a U.S. warship. But this group's been embroiled in this conflict in the region for years. This isn't this isn't new in terms of their involvement in the region. And this is a conflict that involves Saudi Arabia, and one in which the United States has vacillated quite a lot in terms of their views and stance toward the Houthis. So it's complicated. The stakes are very high for the region and possibly the world. So Eric, can you ground us kind of in the here and now in the news? Where do things stand after these myriad altercations in the Red Sea?
Well, Jen, thanks first of all to IOP for having me and my colleagues on to talk about this really important topic. I think what you have now is obviously since the tragic attacks in Israel on October 7th, you have a number of these so-called Iran-backed groups, whether it's Hezbollah, Hamas, or the subject of today, the Houthis of Yemen, that are basically throwing their solidarity behind Palestinians in Gaza. And basically for the Houthis case, they're saying we're going to continue these attacks on international shipping and American warships, international warships, until the fighting ceases and as Israel pulls out of Gaza. The United States and the Biden administration have tried to separate basically this issue from Gaza, basically saying this is not related to Gaza. These are Houthis being opportunistic and basically taking on, as you said, attacking merchant ships in the Red Sea, where about 12% of the world's commerce flows through. They try to make the point that more than 50 countries are impacted by this, whether it's because of the ships or the crews on the ships or the countries where these ships are coming from, and obviously the international commerce that's affected. It's already starting to drive up prices. Inflation has been going up in certain areas in parts of Europe. What the U.S. has tried to do is, at first, they pulled together a coalition of countries, basically a defensive alliance, a maritime alliance that was trying to help escort, in some cases, but at least protect many of these ships going through the Red Sea from these periodic attacks that were coming from the Houthi-controlled areas of Yemen. That was not successful. And so what the U.S. and Britain have done is they've gone on the offensive now, starting on January 11th, where they started attacking various Houthi sites. These are basically their missile and rocket and drone sites, trying to knock down their capability. Basically, it's the idea is, at least if you can try and damage and destroy the capability of going after the Houthis' ability to go after the ships, it'll instill more confidence in shipping companies to resume their routes. That hasn't happened either. And this has all had the effect of elevating the Houthis on the world stage at this moment, probably an outsized effect of what's going on. And so just today, for instance, there were a series of back and forth attacks whereby the U.S. Fighter planes off one of the carriers in the Gulf are now trying to strike some of these missiles before they can be launched. Meantime, the Houthis are launching missiles, ballistic missiles, not only in the Red Sea, but in the Gulf of Aden at the entrance to the Bab el-Mandeb, that crucial waterway strait. And they also launched a naval drone today. So we're seeing the full arsenal of the Houthis on display and in strong defiance, not only of the United States, but the international community. And it's really, I think, underscoring the lack of leverage I think the United States really has in this case, and deterrence really is so far not working. Secretary of State, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan met with his counterpart in Beijing, in China, just this week, basically pleading with the Chinese to put some pressure on the Iranians to see if they could in turn help rein in the Houthi attacks. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin was asked if that's had any effect today, and he said no. So I think right now what we're looking at is probably a continued series of attacks by the Houthis on the shipping. The U.S. will continue to strike, with some cases with Britain as an ally. But so far, this is looking like a prolonged campaign on both sides.
You've alluded to a lot of things you want to unpack, including Houthis' capabilities, the broader implications for the world. And I want to pick up on one thing you said about motivations in this particular situation. And Professor Philbrick Yadav, ground us in some history. Eric's put us in the here and now and the today. Since you're an expert on this group and its history, and one thing I want to pick up on that Eric alluded to is that among nations in the region, Yemen has a long and dedicated demonstration of sympathies with the Palestinian cause, actually, dating back before partition in the 1940s. Help us understand that historical context, and perhaps you can also, if you have time in this particular answer, insert Saudi Arabia into it, because it's actually quite relevant to the genesis of this.
Sure. So again, thank you for having us and for organizing this event. I kind of want to interpret what the Houthis are doing right now as a performance of sovereignty and try and explain what I mean by that. If you look back historically, as you said, Jennifer, there's long-standing popular solidarity with Palestinians and actually official government solidarity with Palestinian organizations. And so the Kingdom of Yemen, as far back as 1947, within a month of being admitted to the United Nations as a voting member, voted against the partition of Palestine. In the 1970s, South Yemen, which the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, allowed Palestinian militants to launch an attack in the Red Sea from within Yemen. In 1973, the Bab el-Mandeb was closed by the Yemenis during the war that year with Israel. And both the Yemen Arab Republic, which was North Yemen, and South Yemen, housed over 1,000 Palestinian militants who left Beirut in 1982 after the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. So there's been this sort of consistent, both symbolic and material thing. And then if you look at the status of Palestinian refugees living in Yemen, and I know sometimes it's hard to imagine that Yemen, which has faced so much war and conflict itself, is actually hosting refugees, but there are Palestinian refugees living in Yemen, and they actually receive the same rights and resources as citizens. So right now, that's not much in the context of Yemen's ongoing war, but historically, right, the governments of Yemen, in its multiple instantiations, those governments have actually performed this kind of sovereign solidarity. So I see what the Houthis are doing as making a bid to be read and recognized as the government of Yemen. And I think it's really important to recognize that they are not the only faction in Yemen. So it's completely incorrect factually to refer to them as the Yemeni government, as a lot of social media content does. It drives me up a wall. But they're one of several factions in this longstanding civil war, right? And so I think that's part of this, is performing that kind of sovereignty to a domestic audience and to a regional audience. They very much want to be seen as regional rivals of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, et cetera, not one of the domestic factions in Yemen. So I think that's how I interpret this predominantly.
Okay, and there's a lot of threads there I want to pick up on. But I want to go to you, Professor Noor. Your work is focused on ideologically driven liberation struggles So while this story is viewed domestically here, largely as one as a national security story for us, for Europe, for the world perhaps, and obviously an economic one given what's going on with the trips. How do you contextualize this conflict through the frame of your work and perhaps engaging in what you've heard so far?
I think what we see in the popular discourse here, especially in media coverage, is pretty much an international conflict right now. And it is since the Gaza conflict, the Houthi rebel group or the de facto government of some parts of Yemen, mostly north part of Yemen, has just seized that opportunity to kind of be part of this conflict. And it has it is doing that, as they said, I think, to kind of boost its own confidence, its international support and recognition, and it has been doing that, especially in the Persian Gulf region. So the downside of that is that the shift to the coverage, the attention has shifted from the domestic issues, the domestic cause and dynamics of the conflict to the international aspect of it. But it's very much a domestic conflict, I think. It's very much part of this ongoing conflict that has created the world's worst humanitarian crisis in the past decade, 10 years or so. So what we see is, I think the problem, as Eric and especially Stacey pointed out to, is that the Houthis were able to kind of, I think, outflank a lot of the other rival political groups that they have been fighting against, allied with Saudi Arabia and its allies. But at the same time, it is a weak kind of ideologically not oriented kind of rebel group. It doesn't have like a solid ideological goal that is motivating it. So the problem is they're trying to kind of root themselves domestically, and this is an opportunity for them to galvanize support, because a lot of the Yemenis, as is the case around the Arab world, are in favor of the Houthis position when it comes to the Gaza conflict. And they're going to be gaining more support, and of course conscripts as well for their conflict. The unfortunate problem is also a rebel group that is religiously motivated without a clear ideological goal, and is not providing the needed governance, law and order, public institutions, and public services for the parts of Yemen it controls. It's more an authoritarian kind of group with oppressive grip on the areas it controls in the northern parts of Yemen. So I think it's important to look at really focus on the domestic aspect of this conflict as well. And going forward, I think any lasting solution for the conflict has to really pay attention to the domestic origins and dynamics of the conflict.
Which is probably something that Americans haven't thought much about, the domestic situation in Yemen, even though it's been in the news obviously for years. It's definitely receded, right, in the consciousness here and perhaps around the world. Eric, your coverage has sort of suggested that there's a surprise about the Houthis' capabilities. Can you say more about that? And also, you didn't allude to, you directly stated that the fear in Washington that this is going to kind of essentially open up a new front of a wider international conflict. I mean, is that, the Pentagon freaking out basically to, table rattling as we sometimes see, or do you think that this is a really legitimate fear, and is it shared by, our allies?
Well, I think, Jen, what we've seen here is the Pentagon is trying to play catch up and trying to understand better just how large the Houthi arsenal is. This is not, a fight that the Americans have had for some time. Of course, the U.S. did and still has a small number of military advisors in another part of Yemen, basically in counterterrorism missions against the Al-Qaeda affiliate there, but they have not directly engaged with the Houthis. They did, of course, provide assistance to the Saudis and the Emiratis in the air campaign, but that campaign has really been suspended for almost a couple of years. So the Pentagon has been trying to understand a little bit better about what exactly the Houthis have in terms of their capability. Much of what they have in terms of their rockets and missiles and drones has come from Iran, and components have been smuggled in. They've also have an indigenous capability of their own, though, underground facilities. They've been able to put this together. And so combined with what they inherited from the Salih government years ago, as well as what the Iranians have provided, they have quite an arsenal at their disposal, and that I think is what the U.S. has been trying to get their arms around. Just where is it? They've proved, obviously, in a nearly decade-long air campaign with the Saudis and Emiratis to be quite resilient and effective in launching their own attacks against the Saudis and Gulf states too. So this has posed a problem for the administration as they try and target this. And you go back to your second part of your question. President Biden, in particular, has been very concerned from the get-go after the October 7th attacks and not having the conflict in Gaza spill over into other parts of the Middle East. And this is one area that's been front and center for the administration as these attacks on shipping, and there have been more than 36 or so since October 7th. What is the response, and how do you calibrate a military response to this without escalating the conflict into something larger? And this again is what the administration has tried to do is focus on damaging or destroying the Houthis' capability. They really haven't gone after any of the senior commanders. They've definitely tried to avoid civilian casualties. So they've tried to keep this as discrete series of attacks as possible. And yet, as we've seen in other places, certainly in the attacks recently against U.S. forces in Iraq, Syria, and Jordan, the war is widening to other fronts. And so that's a big concern for this administration.
Just two real quick follow-ups. One, do the Houthis recognize publicly that they are getting any weapons from Iran? This is what the U.S. government says. Do they recognize that? Are they more elusive about that? And second, can you just, I know it's a lot to unpack, but kind of just briefly give a little bit of a synopsis about the United States' positionality with Saudi Arabia in this, because it's kind of been a bit of a back and forth, right?
Yeah, I'll defer to Stacey. Maybe she can talk a little bit more about where the Houthis and the Iranians, specifically what they've acknowledged and getting. This, of course, is the view of the U.S. intelligence community. Of course, the U.S. initially supported the Saudi campaign. This is when the Saudis believed they could come in and very quickly, squelch the Houthis moving south from their enclaves in the north. Ultimately, that failed, though, and the Houthis took the capital in Sana'a. And it's been a very bloody campaign for Saudi Arabia, and one that they tried to extricate themselves so far without a whole lot of success, despite some recent negotiations in the last over 18 months, 2 years, to strike a ceasefire and ultimately withdraw and get a deal there. The U.S. provided, some assistance, some general intelligence to the Saudis. There's a question, obviously, of the weaponry the Saudis have. Many of it was armaments, bombs, for instance, that the Saudis purchased from the United States. And so there's, some responsibility the U.S. has borne in that regard. Although the Americans have not been we're not sitting in the Saudi command centers picking targets. And yet, the U.S. has had to bear some of the responsibility for just the tremendous number of civilian casualties that were the result of this air campaign, and one that was not executed very well by the Saudis and Emiratis. And thankfully, that campaign is, really kind of, hasn't ceased completely, but it's really the ceasefire and the pause and those airstrikes, thankfully, is abated over the last year and a half.
So I do want you to pick up on that if you could, and we are going to get to. I am Tim Houthi Chamelet, but because I know that's been a source of irritation for you. But I was going to ask you about that next. But I would like you to pick up where Eric left off, because I think we take it as an article of faith, right? That this is one of many proxies of Iran. That's what we're to understand. Do you agree with that analysis? What can you add there?
So I've been pretty consistent in my writing on this in acknowledging that there's absolutely a relationship of support with Iran, but questioning to some extent the proxy framing. I think it would behoove us to consider them allies who are enabled by Iran, but definitely not a force that's being directed by Iran in that sense. That said, I'm not that surprised that when Abdulmalik Houthi said that there was going to be retaliation against the U.S. for these airstrikes, I was pretty certain that wouldn't happen in Yemen, that it would be very hard to find an appropriate American target to strike in Yemen at this point. There aren't very many that would come to mind, and they have limited capacity to reach outside. I think other Iranian allies may be kind of dishing out some of that retaliation. And that's a real concern, right? And that requires some level of, if not coordination, communication, and sort of shared alliance structure. That said, I think there's a bigger issue here in the idea that this is a scrappy or ragtag militia. This is terminology that we see in a lot of the media coverage of the Houthis. I think that stems from these sort of images of often young child soldiers, often people not wearing shoes, these kind of sensationalistic images of who the Houthis are. But the thing to remember is that they haven't just survived a decade of asymmetric warfare with Saudi Arabia or the Saudi-led coalition. Before that, they also survived 6 rounds of warfare with the Yemeni government in the 2000s. So from 2000 to 2010, they were fighting consistently against the Yemeni military. And in the last round of that fighting in 2010, also against the Saudi, being subject to aerial attacks by the Saudis. So what's relevant about that is that there was a massive amount of civilian harm that resulted from that warfare, and it didn't hurt the Houthis. It did not set them back. That sense of victimhood or sort of asymmetric kind of conflict works for them narratively, right? It's something that they're able to use to make an argument and to build support outside of the narrowest part of their base. So I see that as actually really important. And I think that it's a good thing that US forces are trying to avoid civilian casualties. I also think hitting civilian casualties will not weaken this political movement necessarily. I don't know if I answered all parts of your question, but I definitely wanted to bring the 2004 to 2010 part of their military history here, because they know how to survive asymmetric warfare, and they've been doing it for 2 decades.
I think just picking up on the part of your critique of the perceptions, how much of this is also part of how this, like everything else, has entered the TikTok social media realm? I mean, with this TikTok, do I use TikTok star? Is that the right word? Rashid Al Haddad, the Tim Houthi Chalamet, like what's up with that?
Right. I mean, I think that the perceptions are being influenced by that. My students are asking me about this, and they're learning a lot, some of it good, some of it not as great, from social media venues, for sure. There's also the romanticization of a kind of violent Arab masculinity. There are a lot of layers that we could unpack here. But for me, I honestly really do start with the scrappy ragtag framing, because I think that that's really ahistorical, and it doesn't kind of account for the longevity of this movement, and also, some elements of its sophistication. When they took over the Capitol in 2015, they entered the Capitol in 2014, they drove other actors out into early 2015. They captured the bureaucracy of the state in North Yemen, and they've been running it, and not necessarily effectively, and certainly not responsibly, or in a way that many people would like or admire, but they are running a chunk of the state and doing that successfully. So I just think that the tendency to underestimate them is a part and parcel of a general tendency to underestimate Yemenis, to disregard their political sophistication, because it's one of the poorest countries in the world. And I think that that's really regrettable.
Professor Noor, do you agree with that? And can you tell us more about sort of how the broader impacts in the Horn of Africa with this conflict?
Yes, I do agree with Stacey's assessment, definitely. I think the Houthi militia group has become more than Iran's proxy. The longevity of the conflict, to the extent to which it has been on this conflict, and the possibility that it could have captured most of Yemen without the Saudi UAE intervention after 2015 just speaks to the fact that the conflict itself and the militia group, the Houthi, that has been like driving this conflict since since the 2000s, it's very much internally grounded and it has been driven by internal migrants. So that's an accurate assessment. The broader security or economic ramifications for the Horn of Africa. It is certainly Horn of Africa is the most proximate region to the Arabian Peninsula and to Yemen in particular. Itself it is an unstable region. The Horn of Africa, there has been conflict, ongoing similar conflicts between internationally recognized very ineffective government in Mogadishu, the Somali capital, against other armed groups, specifically Islamic group known as the Shabab. We find similar conflicts, civil war or quasi-civil war conflicts in the rest of the country, especially Ethiopia. And northern Sudan has been embroiled in a similarly bloody conflict since 2 years now. So that region has been already unstable and has been in its own conflict. And I think in my assessment, what has been going on in Yemen, especially with the Al-Houthis kind of pop up into the international conflict arena and the instability that has caused in that region. It's expected to exacerbate all these local conflicts, whether it is in Sudan, in Ethiopia, and especially in Somalia. I would think in Somalia in particular, that conflict has this religious dimension. West versus the Iran on the one hand, and other Islamic extremist groups on the other hand. So I think it is going to be a matter of time if the conflict in Yemen continues in the current form. The conflict in Somalia might just be part of it, and it's not remote geographical as well. And the other countries, places like Djibouti, Eritrea, Somaliland itself, their economies and their securities are very much intertwined as part of the Red Sea security basin and the Red Sea commercial route itself. And the conflict has now, in the role of the Houthi, has very much disrupted that commercial route, as Eric was previously pointing out. And those countries, especially Djibouti, Eritrea is not very much part of the international commerce itself. It is kind of a rogue regime, which is very not part of the multilateral commercial, economic, and political relations. But Djibouti has been very much of that kind of a Western ally, but also its economy is very much dependent on the commercial route, providing ports and cargo and storage for that commerce. Now with the disruption, it is very unlikely the Djiboutian economy is going to remain stable.
And Eric, you've done reporting in a lot of these regions that Professor Noor was alluding to. So perhaps you can give your view of that too. And also, I'm just curious, last week there were 3 U.S. Army soldiers that were killed and more than 30 service members were injured in that drone attack, a small U.S. outpost in Jordan. Are you connecting the dots with all of that, or is that a separate incident in your view?
No, these are all connected. I mean, these are all basically groups that are linked in one way or another to Iran. They receive financial support, military support, training support from Iran, and they're linked in various ways. They're all different in terms of their degree of independence they have from Tehran, their alliance that they have, and with the Houthis probably the most independent of this group. I mean, some here in the administration in Washington call them a little bit of a wild card because there's a question of whether, indeed, if the hostilities were to cease in Gaza, would the Houthis stop their attacks on the shipping? They did mostly during the 1 week period in November, where there was a ceasefire and the prisoners and hostages were exchanged. So that seems to be the best hope for ending these kind of attacks.
I just want to ask a couple more questions, and then we're going to move to the room. So think of your questions, and we will again take them from students first. Professor Philbrick Yadav, I wanted just to return back I have 2 questions for you. They're not really related, but just quickly going back to the very beginning, when we were talking about the long-standing relationship between Yemen and the Palestinian people, how unusual, were they was Yemen an outlier in those early days, the pre-partition days in that way? And, you know, obviously one of the central points of tension in the Israeli-Palestine conflict concerns Mizrahi Jews, the fate of the Jews that were expelled from other regions and found their home in Israel. And Yemen was, I believe, early among nations that did expel Jews from that region. Does that history play a role in the current conflict? Curious on your view on that. And also, you've done so much work studying peace-building organizations within the country, picking up on where Eric left off. I mean, do you see, to put it in the most simplistic terms, do you see hope for the region of Yemen anytime soon?
Those are really different questions. I might focus on, I'll focus just really briefly on the first one because it's a little bit outside of my time period. Although certainly I'm familiar with it. And when I lived in Israel as an undergraduate, I had a Yemeni roommate. So, you know, this has always been part of what I knew and understood about Yemen. But I think that across the whole region, the creation of the state of Israel itself contributed to the unmaking of diversity in the surrounding Arab states, right? It contributed to a changing relationship of Jewish communities to non-Jewish majorities. And Yemen fits that pattern, but I don't really think Yemen was an outlier in its early solidarity. However, where I do think it may be distinct is at least because I'm more familiar with it, in the way that Yemenis talk about Yemeni Jews and recognizing always the role of Jews in Yemeni history. So I think people would be really surprised by that, given the overt hostility of the Houthi movement and its slogans, and given that most of Yemen's Jewish population did leave in the 1950s. But I remember being in a cab in Sana'a when this song came on the radio, and it was a song by an Israeli Yemeni group, and it was playing on Yemeni radio. And that was because people understood it to be a Yemeni song or part of the Yemeni, the extended diasporic Yemeni tradition. And I see the same kind of thing happening among some Yemeni American communities around convergence there. So I actually think that story is really interesting and complex. I don't think Yemen stands out in its 1947 solidarity particularly. In terms of looking forward, future peace process, what the Houthis are doing right now is going to have a really big impact on peace talks. There's a special envoy to the Secretary General of the UN who's dedicated to the case of Yemen. Multiple people have held that office over the period of its existence. None of them have been particularly successful in brokering a peace from the top, right? So my book is actually about the fact that Yemeni civil actors or civilian communities are not sitting around waiting for the UN special envoy to broker just the right deal. They're actually engaged in everyday peace building in local communities. And we see this in other conflict zones, like in Colombia. This was a big part of how eventually a more peaceful outcome became possible. So that's what my own research is on, and I've been doing that collaboratively with international and Yemeni peace-building organizations for the past several years. I really enjoy doing that work. Am I optimistic? Not particularly, and one of the reasons for that is that the peace process as it exists right now is anchored to a UN resolution, 2216, for those of you who are keeping track. And that resolution understands this as a war between the Houthis and the internationally recognized government of Yemen. That internationally recognized government of Yemen has very little reality on the ground. And there are several other conflict actors who don't fit into that binary understanding, including international actors like Saudi Arabia. So there is a really unrealistic framework for trying to resolve this formally that really just kind of overdetermines the fact that it's being resolved informally in local communities in ways that are uncoordinated across the territory. I can say tons more about that, but I think I'll leave it there.
All right, I'd love to open it up to the group, so everyone can know who you are too as well. First, Noor, just introduce yourself. If you're a student, what year you are, and for the community too, if you just introduce yourself by name at least, so they know who they're speaking to. And I'd love to just go ahead and open it up to questions for anybody in the group. Students first.
Hello, thank you all for this very informative panel. I'm Hassan. I'm a student at the University of Chicago. I study history. I wanted to ask about the Houthis in relation to the war on terror framework that the Biden administration is continuing to apply. So Biden redesignated the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization. And of course, this is you know, a way of viewing the region that is shared by Israel. After October 7th, the main framework that the Israeli state put forward is that Hamas equals ISIS, or Hamas is just another one of these terrorist groups that the US has fought. You know, also designating Hezbollah as a terrorist organization, all of the Shi'a groups that formed in Iraq after the US invasion, also as terrorist groups. But on the other hand, we have, you know, most of the global South sees that Israel is committing a genocide against the Palestinians. The International Court of Justice has said genocide is plausible. So obviously there are, you know, competing frameworks. There's one framework where the US says the Houthis are a terrorist organization. The Houthis turn around and say, no, actually we are enforcing international law. We're acting in solidarity to prevent a genocide. And obviously have gained a lot of international support for that. So I want to ask, do you think that this war on terror framework that the US has applied since 9/11 and that Israel is continuing to apply in its genocidal war is at a breaking point? Is it feasible anymore?
Anyone?
Want any one particular one of us to take that?
I defer to the expert as I'm the least knowledgeable in this area.
Go ahead, Professor.
Okay, so I think it's a great question for that. I think it's really important that we can do two things at once. One, that we can be, I think, appropriately really critical about the implications of the designation. Biden, just to give people in the room a little bit of a timeline. In 2018, there was an effort to list the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization, and there was a major international kind of mobilization against it. Because it would have had really devastating humanitarian consequences, because it would have basically stopped goods from coming in the port of Hodeidah, which is an important entry point for food aid, medicine, things like that. So there was a big humanitarian push to not move forward with that. And that wasn't about whether or not they were doing things that were harmful to people. It was about whether or not the harm of the designation would outweigh whatever was going to be accomplished by it. In January of 2021, shortly before leaving office, former President Trump designated them and threw kind of everything up in the air. And President Biden removed that designation in February of 2021. So it was a very small window and it didn't have enough time really to have huge implications. But that's the backstory. President Biden has not actually quite, as Hassan put it, designated them an FTO, a foreign terrorist organization, but especially designated terrorist organization, which seems like a small, you know, like I'm splitting hairs, but there are some material implications in terms of who can deal with them in what way. Designating them is going to make a negotiated peace process really hard. It's going to make a power sharing framework that recognizes that the Houthis will be a part of a future in Yemen really hard, and they will be. Like, whether or not we think the Houthis are a good organization or not, they're going to, I do not believe, and general consensus among people who follow this closely is that there is not a military solution that results in the crushing of the Houthi movement. That we have 20 years to draw on in reaching that conclusion. So when I said we need to do two things at once, I think it's that we need to kind of question the terrorist designation and the efficacy of that, and without lionizing who the Houthis are or what they're doing as an organization, because they are committing human rights violations on the regular. And in fact, independent human rights organizations have really amply documented that they commit more than any other conflict actor. They're not, in that sense, engaged in good governance. So I think it's important. This is separate from the question of whether or not I or others might agree with the idea of solidarity with Palestine, right? I just think that there needs to be a way to question designating them as a terrorist organization without lionizing their politics.
And Eric, I mean, no one in the country knows the Pentagon and the global war on terror from start to finish, if it's indeed finished, more than you. What is from your position, how do you think about that question?
I agree with Stacey in the complications that the designation and removing it had for the Biden administration. They really resisted. This is a contentious issue within the administration, whether to even take the halfway step that Stacey described. But it really became, difficult for the administration not to do anything. And so, in light of what the Houthis were doing, from a counterterrorism standpoint, historically, the real actor that the Pentagon has gone after since 9/11 are not the Houthis, but it's Al Qaeda, AQAP, which of course still to this day is considered by U.S. counterterrorism officials in the United States as perhaps the most lethal, the most dangerous terrorist organization, even though its effectiveness has been curbed quite a bit. Obviously, it's been engaged as part of this larger civil war. It's one of the actors on the ground here doing this. But these are the group that both had not only the desire to attack the United States, but the means to it. If you think about the underwear bomber, this guy that came from AQAP, so they had the capability to create, bombs on airliners, and almost succeeded in that regard. And so we don't hear much about kind of the terrorism attacks, since 9/11, certainly with the fading away of a little bit of Al Qaeda, and even with ISIS now less in the news than it was before. But that's kind of how counterterrorism experts have thought about the threat coming out of Yemen.
Any other questions? Anyone this side of the room? Go ahead, sir.
Can you just answer the simple question of what do the Houthis want, separate from the Israeli-Palestine question? Because I still have no idea.
They would like to be the sovereign and internationally recognized government of Yemen.
What is their plan? Is it just a power struggle that they want to, or do they have a different ideology with the government of Yemen? Like, why are they doing this other than power?
So there isn't really much of a government of Yemen, but if we talk about the internationally recognized government of Yemen, which is sort of a group of people who were displaced and some have reconstituted elsewhere, there isn't a cohesive ideology that guides them because it's a coalition of different political parties. And that goes back to the Arab uprisings. Yemen had a revolution. Its longstanding dictator was removed from office. And there was an internationally brokered transitional agreement. And that internationally brokered transitional agreement, critically, it didn't really include the Houthis. So the Houthis had already been around for a long time and they were important and had pockets of popular support. They were left out of the power sharing government and in 2012, and they basically forced their way into the power sharing government in 2014. They walked into the capital pretty much without resistance, some complicated reasons that I can't get into. And they said, we'd like to be part of the cabinet now. And they renegotiated the terms of the transitional government, eventually then within a few months, pushed the others out. So it is an ideologically diverse group. They would add to that diversity. They are doctrinally Zaidi Muslims. There are many Zaidi Muslims who do not support the Houthi movement. There are many people in Yemen who are not Zaidi Muslims. So that's like one important cleavage, but certainly not the only one. They're from the north, and the north-south cleavage matters a lot in Yemen. So, I mean, I don't think that this is entirely about ideology. I think that they would like to establish and further expand the rule that they have entrenched in part of the country to all of the country and to govern.
Anyone? Go ahead, please.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I was wondering, I think we've seen a lot of different forms of US intervention in this conflict specifically. And just today, Biden imposed sanctions upon Israeli settlers in the West Bank. So I wonder, how do we consider these sort of different actions that seem to have potentially conflicting motives behind them, and especially in consideration with the many non-state actors. How do we sort of reconcile that in terms of what the US government, its aims are in the region currently?
I mean, I'll take a first crack at that. I mean, you know, the administration is always going to look for different tools they can apply, whether it's economic sanctions, diplomatic sanctions of different kinds. And ultimately, if those don't work, and if international coalitions don't work, then the last resort should be, that as only as a last resort should military action be taken. And that's kind of what happened here. If you go back, just looking at since October 7th, and these attacks that the Houthis were having on commercial ships and international war vessels like the U.S. Navy ships. Again, the U.S. position initially was see if they can ride this out. Can they put a defensive, shield essentially into that waterway to basically help knock down whatever's being fired at the shipping? Well, that didn't. I mean, it mostly worked, but you couldn't convince nearly a dozen shipping companies that they take that risk, and so you ended up with economic pressures placed on the United States in particular as the leader of this coalition to take the next step. And that next step has been this military action. But as we've been discussing now for almost the last hour, military action really that's not the only solution. It can't be the only solution here. Ultimately, this has to be solved through other means. But right now, if you think of it very simplistically, it's basically degrade and deplete. How do you degrade the capability that the Houthis have militarily to continue these attacks on shipping and deplete their arsenal? And they got a big one, so this could go on for a long time if this were the path that we're on. But obviously, people are looking at different ways of averting that.
I can say one thing about the coalition that didn't come up in our earlier discussion, but I think is noteworthy. Neither Saudi Arabia nor the United Arab Emirates are a part of that coalition of forces that the United States put together in the Red Sea. And I think that's really significant because they both have commercial interests in keeping the Red Sea navigable, and it's in their neighborhood. And I would argue that the reason that they aren't there, the only regional actor who I believe is a part of the coalition is Bahrain. And I would argue that the reason for that is because those two actors are actually engaged in the domestic conflict in Yemen and understand that they're being boxed in by the Houthis in some ways, right? They both also were engaged in normalization with Israel shortly before October 7th. And it appears that the United States is probably still interested in seeing normalization go forward in some way. I'm not sure. I recently described that as politically radioactive, I think, for the Saudis and the Emiratis. And the Red Sea campaign has helped to make it that way, right? Make it politically radioactive because the Houthis are going to hold themselves up against not other Yemeni factions, but against Saudi Arabia and against the UAE as the defenders of Palestine.
On that, I think the US position on when it comes to the conflict lately, it just has been part of its position in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which has become so unpopular and in fact continues to be misguided. And its position with regards to the conflict in Yemen has also been scrambled and unproductive as a result of that. And if you look broadly, like now Houthi has become, it has been part of, as an ally of Iran. It has been part of the constellations or proxies, not simply proxies, but armed groups that has been closely allied to and dependent on Iran in the region, known as the axis of resistance, basically. And that includes Houthi. Now Houthi has become very much big part of that, in fact. And you have Hamas in Palestine, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and other Shia militias in places like Syria, as well as Iraq in that region. So it has become a constellation of those different armed groups allied to and supported by Iran. And in US position, it seems unsustainable, basically. It kind of really shifted dramatically from before the October 7 attacks and the Houthi involvement in the conflict. But as to where it might go from now on, it very much is going to be dependent on the US's policy towards the Gaza conflict itself.
I think we have time for one more quick question. Sure, in the back, please.
What is Iran's interest in backing the various groups in the Middle East?
Did you hear that question? What is Iran's interest in these groups?
Well, so I've long been of the view that Iran is in the business of backing winners. And what I mean by that is not backing organizations that have actually achieved any grand strategic aim, but backing groups that can survive their local domestic political contexts. And so, for example, in the 2000s, when the Houthi movement was fighting off the Yemeni government, reports of Iranian support for the Houthis were grossly exaggerated. And in fact, we have congressional testimony to that effect. Like, the United States government understood that the president of Yemen was saying it was Iran that was supporting the Houthis, but there wasn't a heavy imprint at that point. After they held off the government successfully for a long time, and then there was a climate of disorder following his removal from office, then Iranian support started to be much more substantial. And what I know of Iranian support for Hezbollah, for example, follows a somewhat similar pattern. So I think it's a low-cost strategy for them compared to more direct confrontation, whether that's confrontation of Saudi Arabia or of the United States or of Israel.
Wonderful. We're gonna end a little early today so we can turn our room around for 4:30, another activity here in the room. I want to thank all of our guests who came out today on a relatively nice day in Chicago. You might have had other options. This did kick off Hot Chocolate Month at the IOP, so we will have hot chocolate and donuts at a lot of our events to keep you warm while you come. And I especially want to thank our panelists for taking their time out of their incredibly busy days to come and help illuminate this incredibly important issue. And we just really appreciate your time. They all have books. Go on Amazon, find them, read them, support them, and thank you again so much for your time.
Thank you.